why is the world in the mess that it's in right now?
Sheldon Solomon is best known for co-developing terror management theory based on the theories of social scientist Ernest Becker concerning how humans deal with their own sense of mortality. He is professor of social psychology at Skidmore College and is the author or co-author of over 100 articles and several books.
Why is there war and widespread violence? Why in the 21st century does humankind still resort to killing one another to settle our differences? I'm Sheldon Solomon. This is episode 6 of our Conversation series. In this episode, we ask the question, what is at the heart of the problem of war and violence?
Why is it that Americans fight a continual, nonstop, expensive war with dead people on all sides against enemies that don't really threaten us? You know, against people who are way over the horizon and don't have any immediate power to injure us or even our friends.
How much injustice, how much torture in these camps in Iraq? How many civilians have to be cordoned and captured and tortured, even though that might not be called torture by our government? How many people have to be massacred? How many civilians have to be blown up? How many hundreds of thousands of civilians have to be destroyed or affected with depleted nuclear shells? How much rape around the globe do you have to see before you actually think this is important enough to care about?
In almost every war where there are massacres and, atrocities that are never punished. There's no army in the world that ever seriously and systematically brings judicial punishment to bear on soldiers who run amok.
Right. But now, somebody gets beheaded in Syria and it's on YouTube and now we got to kick their ass. To me, that's got to create some potential for extraordinarily incendiary reactions that are grotesquely out of proportion.
What are the psychological underpinnings of war and violence?
From our point of view, what we write about in our book and what Becker writes about is just the inevitability of war as a result of a fundamental inability to tolerate people who don't share our beliefs. And then the thing that I find even more disturbing is the Beckerian idea that because our beliefs are symbolic and death anxiety is a physical entity, that no belief is ever going to be enough to completely eradicate anxiety. And therefore, we've got this residual death anxiety. And the only way we could manage it is to project it onto other individuals or groups of people, rather, that we designate as the all-encompassing repository of evil. So one of the points that Becker makes that I find compelling is that every culture so far has the designated evildoers, where they say, if only we didn't have these scum, everything would be good. So the Americans had the Russians. In Ireland, you had the Protestants and the Catholics. Now in the Middle East, we got the Sunnis and the Shiites. And so one possibility is that there will be war as long as humans exist in our current condition.
When Chris Hedges and Vamik Volkan talk about war as a force that gives us meaning, it is a fantasy of heroic conquest of evil that psychologically displaces inner loathing and abjection and misery, enables us to overcome a sense of ignominy and helplessness by focusing on the evil other, whom we could triumph over in an act of goodness, right? And this is why Becker says that throughout history, so much bloodshed and slaughter have been inflicted by those who are trying to overcome evil.
We keep trying to recreate the good feeling of being purely innocent heroes as we were in World War II. There's no natural limit on heroism. You know, everything you can do today that's heroic is going to look tame and weak tomorrow, so you have to do something more. And ultimately, that's the same truth in warfare. You kill one enemy, you kill two enemies, and you have to end up killing thousands of enemies. You have to end up, in effect, in a kind of extermination to feel good about your virtue.
When we see business competition as war and athletics, and you're like, oh, we crushed them, fine, but it's one thing to crush the opponent on the football field as opposed to literally annihilating and disemboweling them on the battlefield.
If you want to be heroic, it means you end up having to exceed the norms of your culture. You have to stand out. But since we're in a competitive culture, and every culture has people competing to be the supreme hero, it means that the heroes have to constantly outdo themselves and and stretch the values.
I do think that's the most arresting notion, as Jerry pointed out earlier, from Escape from Evil, when Becker says the root cause of evil is the seemingly heroic effort to rid the world of evil. You know, it's why he said in that book, I'm not cynical, but I'm awfully pessimistic. And, I think, Kirby, you just said something that is perhaps, not perhaps, easier said than done, but it seems like it comes down to a radical alteration in value.
When Becker talks about our pursuit of heroism, he doesn't mean that we actually want to do anything that might be considered heroic. It's about achieving admiration in valor in the eyes of others in society.
That kind of selfish, egotistical mindset kind of limits the ability we have to interact with people that share different belief systems than us. So I think really the major impacts that has are like wars, and like the Iraq conflict, for instance, all the conflict in the Middle East.
How do conflicting worldviews affect war and violence?
Because people are naturally curious about why they do what they do. There's thousands of books written about these underlying forces that drive our behavior, and what we're talking about is the unobservable fear that drives the observable things that we can see when we try to prove that we're great, that we're valuable, that they're beautiful or intelligent, giving us the confidence that we're right when they agree with us and taking away that confidence when they disagree.
What's the problem? So I've got my worldview.
Right.
And it allows me to feel like I'm part of this meaningful reality, and I'm significant. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to go on forever. So why does that have any negative implications in the world?
If your understanding of the world is true, mine isn't, because I see things very differently. So I have to hate you and kill you to prove that my way is right, and to diffuse the challenge that your mistaken reality poses to mine.
Yeah,
right.
And so that was where we started originally.
Right. So birth and death of meaning, Becker first lays that out. That other cultures are always a potential menace to our own because they're conveying a different conception of reality that calls ours into question. And if we have to hold on to ours to feel psychologically secure in the face of our mortality, then somebody else's we have to decide is wrong.
Yeah, at the root of it is the idea that there's truth. There's a single truth. And if I have a truth, yours has to be the same. And if it's not, you're wrong or I'm wrong. And of course, I'd much rather have him be wrong.
No, fair enough. So that in terms of, well, why is this important? I would start with that. Let's try and figure out why people can't get along with other people who are different.
One of the real challenges, Sheldon, is that people are, if we're right, people are so committed to their version of why the world is fucked up, and they're going to cling to it and find other people to support it and crush those who think the world is fucked up for other reasons. So, for example, the Islamic State is pretty convinced they know why the world is fucked up, and they're very disturbed by people who have different theories about why that is, and they're going to go out and get those folks, just as the Western world is pretty convinced that the Islamic State's version of why the world is fucked up is wrong and that we need to defeat that evil. But that's one of the implications, is that different understandings of how the world works or why the world is fucked up is going to drive people to want to eliminate those competing explanations, leading the world to become more fucked up. Not so long ago, I remember people complaining about the problem with American politics is basically everyone saying the same thing in different color suits and different color ties. But I don't think that's true anymore. I think there's at least two very distinct views of reality that are directly in conflict with each other. And, if, for example, if immigration really is going to destroy our people, those who see things otherwise are an enemy to Donald Trump and others saving the world by squashing immigration. If Donald Trump's ideas are really a threat to a good world the way other people see it, like probably we see it, his existence is a very dangerous thing.
Florette Cohen and Sheldon Solomon spearheaded this work on political preferences and found that when people are reminded of death, they become more drawn toward charismatic kinds of political figures. We need somebody to look up to, right? So we got that, we have that empirical evidence, and we showed how that related to the 2004 presidential election, where Bush had a very simple message of we're great and they're evil. So when death is close to mind, we want that charismatic figure who's selling this very simple, we're great, they're evil, follow me and everything will be wonderful, a type of ideology. So we need somebody above us, but we also need to feel better than others. So we're great, but it's partly because we follow this thing or person that is even greater. In Tucson, there's a mosque, and they have a saying on it. It says, happiness is submission to God. Part of the underlying idea that we're trying to get people to understand is that humans are not fundamentally rational, that we're animals. And so we're driven by our desires and our fears. And in our case, we're focusing on the fear of death as something that leads us to need to defend our ideology and attack those who have alternative ideologies. If it wasn't some deep psychological need being served by these different belief systems, we'd be fine. Who cares? You believe that?
Wear
you
whatever
believe that,
shirt
I
you
believe
want.
this.
Yeah.
But that's never okay, because if I'm Islamic and that's an atheist and this person doesn't believe in Allah, believes in some other God, that's psychologically disturbing to me, because my sense of psychological security is tied up in believing in my version. And so it's at the root of intercultural conflict, this problem of the fear of death. So if we didn't have this fear of death and our ideologies were just, well, this is how I understand the world, and that's how there wouldn't be so much tension and problems. If you look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the broader conflict in the Middle East regarding Israel and Palestine, it's not just, you take that piece of land, I'll take this.
No.
Never going to be that. These are holy places to both groups. So because we're invested psychologically, that fear underlies the ideologies that we buy into, we have to defend ours and we have to reject alternative ones. And that's at the core of the inability for people to get along with those from other cultures. So if our culture runs into people with a very different worldview, we have to do something about that. So what do? We derogate them. So if you think about the Europeans as they started exploring and finding these tribal cultures, they could have just said, well, that's what they believe is what we, no, we have to spread the truth. They're just ignorant savages and we have to enlighten them. And when we enlighten them, we can become all the more convinced of the truth of our way. And our way gives us psychological security. So we love that. So there's nothing better than assimilating others into our worldview to make us feel more sure that ours is right, okay? So very simple idea that helps to illuminate the course of history since ancient times. It provides that psychological security that our way is the right way. We're spreading the truth. Why do we have to spread it? Because we have to believe in it. Why do we have to believe in it? Because that's the core way we feel like we're more than just transient creatures, fated only to obliteration upon death.
What makes it an even tougher problem is that the root problem that human beings are dealing with is the fact they're going to die, and that death likely is or may be the end of existence. So there's no real clear solution. It's the fact of life that we're trying to argue around and deny. And many people believe that there's some form of life after death, but there's just no way of knowing that. So that the only way we can feel secure in believing in something we can't see is if lots of other people, the vast majority of other people, agree with us. Yet different people from different parts of the world have come up with different stories about how this all works. If the Christian conception of the afterlife is right, the Buddhist conception has to be wrong. If the Muslim conception is right, the other has to be wrong. These are things that can't be observed or validated in any rational way. So we're left with these ideas coming from ancient stories that can't be validated except by other people.
You're talking about literal immortality and how the belief in literal immortality can be a salve that can help us feel psychologically secure in the face of death. The other approach is symbolic immortality. That gets us into just as much, if not more trouble, because a lot of the symbolic immortality comes down to money, fame, and my group. One of Becker's key points was that cultural perpetuity becomes our basis of death transcendence. And so my group has to keep going. And if I feel any threat to my group, I'm going to have to eliminate that.
And so now here's why we can't get along with people who are different. Here's also why inequality is psychologically unendurable.
What is the significance of being part of something bigger than ourselves?
As humans, we have a need to believe in something larger than ourselves, something meaningful. And if you find that in another person or sort of a larger-than-life figure, it can take you down a path that isn't necessarily a productive or a good one, a good path to go down.
Not only do we need lessers, so we can feel like we're special and we're more significant than us, we need superiors as well.
That's right.
And that's the other side of it. That we always need something bigger than ourselves, because we know, bottom line, no matter how significant, wonderful we think we are, we know we're just creatures. So we always need something bigger than ourselves to buy into as well. And then we have to defend that. We all need that, and then we have to defend that bigger thing, whether it's God, whether it's America, a cult figure, whatever it might be. We both need to feel special, but in the context of some larger framework that we then have to defend. So we not only defend our own significance within the larger framework, we have to defend that framework as well. And that gets us into huge trouble, whether it involves an afterlife and literal immortality beliefs, or is just a basis, a vehicle for symbolic immortality. And so not only does this help explain intergroup conflict and those sorts of problems, those kind of bigger problems, it also helps explain people's fundamental problems in their daily lives.
Ted Cruz, I will chop off the heads of ISIS before they parachute into Buffalo and rape our daughters and steal our chicken wings and so on. And I think we're going to see plenty of death in the air as a way to marshal support for essentially just a whole palette of people right now on that side of the aisle who just claim to unambiguously be able to identify and exterminate evil. I think we're seeing the same dynamics.
People want to become part of something great, and there's the evil, and if we just get rid of that evil, then everything will be wonderful. When the more death is close to consciousness in people, the more they're going to find that appealing. One of the things we talked about was the idea of the rock-type worldview and a hard place-type worldview. And that, in a sense, the world is caught between the rock-type worldviews and the hard place-type worldviews. And the hard place-type worldview is the kind you're talking about, where we understand more about the relativistic nature of belief systems and of truth, and we embrace tolerance and more openness. We're not as sure what's good and what's bad, what's heroic and what's evil. And we try to still do something that we view as heroic and try to combat evil, but we view it in a more tentative way. We're not as certain of things, and that's all great, but it comes at a psychological cost of anxiety, because with less sureness about the rightness of our way of trying to feel significant in the world, you have more anxiety. And so one of the things that we've argued at times is that what goes along with that is more anxiety and more attempts to self-medicate that anxiety away. And I think to some extent you see this, more liberal, open relativistic worldviews You see more use of alcohol, other drugs, pharmaceuticals, consumption, shopping, distractions, and those sorts of things. So you got that. Then the rock-type worldview is more certainty about good and evil, right and wrong. There's more in-group loyalty, we're right, they're wrong, and it's more dangerous and destructive to other groups, without question, but maybe more psychologically secure. If you were Aryan and you were in Germany in the mid-30s, it was awesome. So you get psychological security from the rock-type worldview, and the cost is to those who are designated as the evil that has to be overcome. So ISIS and basically all fundamentalist ideologies, ranging from communist, Christian, Islamic, Jewish, those rigid ideologies work well for those who buy into them, but at great cost to others. Most of us probably would agree that the relativistic ones are better, but there is that cost of anxiety that you have to live with. And I think Kierkegaard used the phrase school of anxiety. You have to live in the school of anxiety. Some of our evidence suggests that the more death is close to mind, the more people tend to gravitate toward the rock-type worldviews. And that gets us back into trouble.
And the relativistic, hard place worldviews are a major threat to rock worldviews, leading to a lot of hostility, just as the rock worldviews are threatening to us relativists. Throughout the world, they're, partly, as a long-term consequence of the Enlightenment and moving in towards the modern era, partly because of the social sciences and psychology and Becker and all these great thinkers over the years. There have been more ideas about how all this works, which really implies a more relativistic view and is a terrible threat to those who see things in more concrete right and wrong ways. To some extent, a lot of the conflicts in the world right now are about rock versus hard place. That seems to be the essence of the political divide in the United States for the most part. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Again, that's painting in broad strokes.
What is the role of righteousness?
I think the danger can be that when human beings believe that they're doing something that has meaning for them, it can lead to stupid behavior. It can lead to negative things. And we talked about the example of Nazi Germany and how those people, they weren't evil, but they believed that they were doing something that was enacting positive change.
One of the things I think Trump is railing about sort of implicitly is the evil of political correctness, of being careful about what you say. I think he's responding to a world where there's so much news coverage of politicians and that people are so careful and constantly walking back their statements. And he's trying to say, I don't have to do that because I'm better than you guys.
And I'm richer.
I'm classier. Yeah. I think that's a big part of his appeal, of his brashness, is people think he's speaking what he really believes. We're all influenced by different cultural and religious traditions. People's moralities are always going to conflict, and those are the nastiest fights. You could argue that all the major wars throughout history have been fights, conflicts about whose morality, whose God was the best.
People working for the tobacco industry still feel that they're moral. Why? Because they have to feel like they're significant, good people in a meaningful world. But the fact that they can feel that way shows that it's very relative, and it's very easy to justify whatever position you take on most anything. I mean, there may be some certain built-in sense of fairness that we may have evolved over a long period of time, some innate sense of fairness, some innate sense. We have capacity for empathy. So if somebody's bleeding, we can have some empathy and sympathy for them. So some of this is innate and built into us. But I don't think there's too many cultures that haven't killed other people in the name of goodness, in the name of righteousness. And so morality doesn't solve a lot because there's so many different ways to justify different positions and different treatment of people, both within a culture and across cultures.
So wouldn't it be safe to say that all wars, all conflicts basically boil down to one group trying to do what they see as better for the world at the expense of another group? Hitler thought he was making Europe a better place by exterminating Jews. Bin Laden thought he was doing the righteous thing by taking down the World Trade Center after American imperialism. The United States thought we were doing a good thing by bringing democracy to Iraq. Islamic State now, the most recent thing I've read is that they think they're doing the right thing by hastening their version of the apocalypse. And that all of these things that we look at and we say, you know, just horrendously, horribly immoral things are done in the name of morality, in the name of making the world better. Whether it be a religious morality or a secular morality like communism. You know, the communists thought we need to kill the capitalists so communism will take hold. Every armed conflict that I've ever heard of basically involved people thinking that they were doing the work of righteousness.
Absolutely.
What are some possible solutions to war and violence?
If you get them to understand their fears and the need to be compassionate about the suffering in the world, that should change them. Ultimately, I'm afraid that's probably more moralistic than it is, likely to get results. Yes. A different way of thinking about it would be to say, maybe what we need is to model compassion. And without saying what its abstract premises are, without even looking at the theory, just model compassion and let them, pit of the stomach, gut identify with that remediation of suffering.
So Becker, at the end of his 3 great books, where he gets down to this problem of death, The Burden, Death, and Meaning, Denial of Death, Escape from Evil, he struggles in the last chapter with, okay, now what? What do we do with this knowledge? What do we, we could try to make our cultural worldviews as truthful as possible, but that's not what people want. That won't serve their psychological needs, so that doesn't work. We could try to identify what is the real evil. What are the real evils?
Yeah.
Right. We have to feel like we're heroically triumphing over some evil, and that evil is kind of now a representation of our fear of death. We could try to find the real evil.
Yeah, it's hate,
poverty. But people, well, we can try poverty, right? But people will never agree on that. The meritocracy, you have to have, some people are going to be poor, so we can't agree about evil. So the fear of death is built within us as animals. We've got the fight or flight or freeze response coming from the amygdala, so we've got that fear. We want to keep going. We're biologically predisposed to want to continue living, so we're never going to fully be able to get over the fear of death. So that's probably not fully possible. So what can anything be done?
If you understand how something works, you can use that to your advantage. The fact that we're going to die is something that, as far as we know right now, can never be changed. That the problem that terror management theory and Becker's thinking points to is there is an unsolvable problem. And unless something radically different happens with our understanding of the world, that problem is going to remain unsolvable. And the theory suggests that people cope with the problem of this unsolvable reality by inventing fantasy worlds where that problem doesn't exist, inventing ways of construing reality that obscure that problem.
Becker vacillates. He vacillates from, we're not a viable form of life, sentient pieces of mortal meat, may be an evolutionary disaster. He certainly was not going to succumb to the cheap and easy solutions that a lot of other folks resort to. By the end of Escape from Evil, where he's like, I'm pessimistic, but I'm not cynical. Maybe we're not a viable form of life. So, yeah, what next? Can we get rid of death? Maybe, maybe not, but it wouldn't matter. Even if you could expect to live to 500,000 years old, the death anxiety might go up rather than diminish, because you could maybe banish death, but you're never going to be able to banish chance, and therefore there's always going to be incidents and accidents that will wreak havoc. And then he's like, oh, well, all right, let's just banish illusions. Let's stop this culturally constructed nonsense and see things as they truly are. Well, that's not going to happen because the very act of perception is fundamentally subjective. So there we are back to we got to have illusions. And So then that shifts the question of, well, what do we mean by a good illusion? And even there, no one's going to agree. Good illusion fosters the provision of physical needs to everybody, and a good illusion gives as many people self-esteem as possible. And a good illusion does that, without denigrating and destroying other people outside and inside the culture. And I think I like that as an abstraction, forgetting about the practical difficulties. And, then I also like when he said at the end of Escape from Evil, it wouldn't be a bad idea if the people who ran Earth heard about these ideas and thought about them.
Or would they just turn them to their own ends?
Well,
we've already been accused of helping the Republicans.
That's right. And so, all right, so before we go that way, you're right.
If you inform leaders of the world that people are driven by the fear of death and these are the directions they're driven by it, are they going to just use that for their own ends as opposed to use it to create societies that are more able to help a wider range of people deal with their psychological fears is unclear. Obviously, terror management theory says that having a meaningful life is a buffer against the fear of death. So if you could grant everybody a sense that they live a meaningful life and they have significance, they're a significant part of that meaningful life, then they'll be better, more psychologically secure, and they'll function better. And that would be great.
So in a sense, our greatest strength as a species that we have some capacity for independent thought. And to make that work, you need to have some sort of overarching value where there's not a truth, where there's not a single path. And it's the single path, single reality that drives us to these problems. And of course, the difficulty with that is on a practical level, it's kind of hard to operate in the world if I think, well, there's multiple realities.
Where is there hope?
Most of the evil in the world is created by people trying to rid the world of evil. And so, there's only two implications of that notion. One is it doesn't matter and we're fucked and we're not a viable form of life. Or the other is that if we can truly understand what underlies various phenomena, then that at least gives us a fighting chance to do something about it. I think there's practical value to understanding why we do certain things.
The better our understanding of how things work, the better our chances of doing something about it. And that walking around with a faulty conception of what makes people do things isn't going to likely to lead you to useful ways of changing them.
Yeah, the same core ideas are applicable not just to understanding human strife, but all of the other things that most people acknowledge to be the, high up on the to-do list for humanity in the 21st century. Do you know Faulkner's Nobel Prize acceptance speech?
No.
It's really very cool because it's a page long. No one wrote more brutally negative, saturated with death, terror.
Right.
And he says in Stockholm, I don't even know if he went, actually. But in the text of it, he says something that I find striking. He's like, everyone says that I wrote these novels because I'm so bitter and that I am only pointing out people at their worst. And he said, no, that's quite the contrary. I'm not bitter. And yes, I do depict people often at their worst because despite that, there's still something he claims that is uplifting and heroic about the human animal at our best. And that's what gives him hope.
No, there's hope.
I'm going with I'm hopeful because there's hope. The analogy I've used in the past is, all right, plague killed half of Europe. And we didn't make any progress as long as we thought that diseases were caused by evil spirits. All we had was like exorcisms and chanting. Then we figured out that it was because of bacteria And once having done that, somebody invented antibiotics. So by analogy, my claim is a credible case could be made that a lot of the difficulties that we now find ourselves encountering are the result of malignant manifestations of death-denying activities. And so if that's the case, then knowing that can't be a bad thing. We need to perceive ourselves as valuable and heroic participants in a world. What can we come up with that will enable people to feel heroic and that will, at the same time, minimize strife and environmental destruction? Why don't we look for people who are engaged with themselves and the world around them in ways that have benign or benevolent effects and see if whatever they're doing can be done on a grander scale or if these ideas can be exported. The ideas get out there, to be momentarily Pollyannish. People have a pretty good track record so far when historically we've encountered serious difficulties. We've done pretty well when we've been able to discern their underlying causes. And if what we've said here today is correct, and that existential concerns that are managed poorly are responsible for some of these difficulties, then that at least gives us a conceptual roadmap. Becker says, this idea that we're going to banish hate, that may be asking too much of people. Maybe we need to hate things. And maybe hate is partially a projected manifestation of repressed death anxiety. But Becker's like, well, if we're going to hate things, let's hate the right things. Let's hate war. Can we imagine a cultural worldview that can exist on its own merits without pitting itself in opposition to something or someone else? Whether naive or not, I see no harm in trying to maximize dissemination of good ideas. And if for no other reason than the more people that are aware of them, the greater the likelihood that someone will be able to really answer that question. Until somebody gives me a better idea, I think we have to start wherever we start, with the hope that the sway of reason can balance destruction.